In the spring of 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, was a city of sharp contrasts. On one side, newly paved streets buzzed with automobiles and oil barons built fortunes seemingly overnight. On the other, the shadow of segregation stretched long and deep, dividing Tulsa by more than just railroad tracks. Beyond those tracks lay Greenwood, a neighborhood born from exclusion, raised by ambition, and destined, at least for a time, to become a monument to black excellence. Greenwood was not an accident. It was the result of visionaries who saw possibility where others saw only limits. When Oklahoma became a state in 1907, its constitution locked segregation into law. Black Tulsans were forced into a 35-block area, marshy, flood-prone, and unwanted by white developers. But in the hearts of its new residents, Greenwood became fertile ground for dreams. O.W. Gurley, a black businessman and landowner from Arkansas, was among the first. In 1906, he purchased 40 acres north of the Frisco Railroad tracks. He sold the land exclusively to black families, built a boarding house, and opened a grocery store. Others followed. J.B. Stratford, born into slavery in Kentucky, came to Tulsa and built the Stratford Hotel, 72 rooms, a restaurant, a barbershop, and a ballroom that became a social and economic heart of the community. Greenwood Avenue soon bustled with commerce. There were grocery stores, restaurants, barbershops, beauty salons, tailors, shoe repair shops, and dry cleaners. Two black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Eagle, told the community stories. Two theaters, the Dreamland and the Dixie, offered movies and vaudeville acts. The Dreamland, run by John and Lula Williams, was a movie palace that rivaled any in White Tulsa. It had a grand marquee, a pipe organ, and velvet seats. For black families in Greenwood, it was a place to gather, to celebrate, and to dream. Churches were the bedrock of Greenwood. 13 congregations, including Mount Zion Baptist and Vernon AME, were not just houses of worship. They were schools, meeting halls, and sanctuaries, places where elders told stories, children found guidance, and the community planned for its future. And there was a black-owned hospital, the Red Cross Sanitarium, founded by Dr. R.T. Bridgewater and Dr. C.W. Kerr. Denied privileges at white hospitals, they trained their own nurses and served their own community. There were black doctors, like Dr. A.C. Jackson, who trained at Meharry Medical College and then in Vienna. He returned to Tulsa as one of the most respected surgeons in the region. White doctors referred their most difficult cases to him. A local white surgeon once called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. He was a man of science, of healing, of peace, living in a beautiful home on Greenwood Avenue with his wife and children. He was 43 years old. Lawyers like B.C. Franklin fought for property rights and civil rights. Franklin, who grew up in the all-black town of Rentisville, Oklahoma, passed the bar in 1907 and opened his own practice in Tulsa. He was known for his sharp mind and his commitment to justice. Real estate developers like J.B. Stratford built fortunes from nothing. By 1921, Stratford was one of the wealthiest black men in America. His hotel was the crown jewel of Greenwood. He was the unofficial mayor of the district. Entrepreneurs like Lula Williams managed businesses and families with determination. She ran the Dreamland Theater, booked films, oversaw staff, and raised her children in the heart of Greenwood. There were teachers, nurses, pharmacists, dentists, architects, contractors, and artists. Greenwood's prosperity was staggering. Property values exceeded $1 million in 1921, over 15 million today, adjusted for inflation. All of it was black-owned, black-built, and black-run. There were no white landlords, no white banks holding the mortgages, no white capital circulating in Greenwood. It was an economic ecosystem that proved black Americans could thrive, despite every obstacle put in their path. It was proof that black excellence was not the exception, but the rule, given the chance. For some in white Tulsa, that was a threat. Greenwood sat across the tracks from downtown. White Tulsans could see the prosperity from their office windows. They saw families in fine clothes, driving cars, living in homes white workers could only dream of. Resentment simmered. Whispers spread. White newspapers, especially the Tulsa Tribune, ran stories that painted black ambition as danger. Headlines inflamed racial tensions. Editorials called for law and order, but their order meant putting black people back in their place. The stage was set for tragedy. All it needed was a spark. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, went to work in downtown Tulsa. His family was well known in Greenwood. His stepfather was a mail carrier, a respected profession among black Tulsans. Rowland worked at a white-owned shoe shine stand on Main Street. Like many black workers, he was forced to use separate facilities. He entered the Drexel building to access the only available restroom for black employees. The elevator operator was Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white woman. What happened in that elevator has never been fully confirmed. Rowland may have tripped and brushed against Page. Some accounts say he stepped on her foot. Others say nothing happened at all. But by evening, rumor became accusation. By morning, accusation became headline. The Tulsa Tribune ran the story. Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator. The article, with no evidence, portrayed Rowland as a predator and Page as a victim. Worse, the Tribune reportedly published an editorial calling for Rowland's lynching. That editorial was later destroyed. By the afternoon of May 31st, word of the alleged assault had spread across Tulsa. A white mob began to gather outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, where Dick Rowland was being held. Sheriff Willard McCullough, recognizing the danger, moved Rowland to the top floor for his protection and stationed armed deputies throughout the building. Tensions rose by the hour. The crowd outside swelled from dozens to hundreds. They shouted, demanded Rowland be handed over, and rumors swirled that a lynching was imminent. Inside Greenwood, the threat was clear. Many of the district's men were veterans of World War I. They had fought for their country, only to return to segregation and second-class citizenship. Yet they were determined that Dick Rowland would not become another victim of mob justice. That evening, a group of about 25 armed black men marched to the courthouse. They offered their services to Sheriff McCullough, who declined, but their presence sent a message. They were joined by others as the night wore on, their numbers growing as reports of the white mob's intentions became more dire. The white mob, seeing black men with guns, responded with shock and anger. Some began to arm themselves. Racial slurs and threats filled the air. Tensions escalated with each passing minute. At around 10 p.m., a white man confronted a black veteran and demanded that he hand over his gun. The veteran refused. A struggle ensued. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but in an instant, chaos erupted. Gunfire broke out on the courthouse steps. The crowd scattered, but the violence was just beginning. White mobs began to arm themselves in earnest, breaking into hardware stores and looting for rifles, pistols, and ammunition. The city was now gripped by panic, fear, and rage. The violence soon spilled into the streets of downtown Tulsa and then into Greenwood itself. White men, some deputized by local authorities and given weapons, began to organize. They moved in groups, some on foot, some in cars, headed north toward Greenwood. They were not a spontaneous or disorganized mob. They were an armed force dedicated to destruction. Throughout the night, shots echoed throughout the city. Buildings were set on fire. Homes and businesses were looted. Black residents fled for their lives, some carrying what they could, others escaping with only the clothes on their backs. Eyewitnesses later recalled scenes of terror and brutality. White attackers fired indiscriminately into homes, set fire to churches, and shot at anyone attempting to resist or escape. Some survivors reported that white families, women and children included, came to watch the violence unfold, standing at the edges of Greenwood and cheering as buildings burned. As the fires spread, hundreds of black residents were forced from their homes. They fled north toward the railroad tracks and into the open countryside. Many gathered at churches, hoping for sanctuary, but the violence showed no mercy. The terror was compounded by the sound of airplanes overhead. Several white pilots used private planes to drop incendiary devices and shoot at fleeing residents. For decades, these accounts were dismissed as legend, but investigations a century later confirmed their truth. The National Guard, called in during the early hours of June 1st, did not immediately move to protect black residents. Instead, guardsmen rounded up fleeing families and marched them to detention centers at the fairgrounds, convention hall, and baseball stadium. Many were held there for days without sufficient food or water. By dawn, Greenwood was in ruins. 35 square blocks had been destroyed. 1,200 homes, dozens of businesses, more than 20 churches. Gone. The sky was thick with smoke, and the streets were littered with debris. The official death toll was reported as 36, but the true number is unknown. The Red Cross estimated at least 300 dead. Some historians believe the number was much higher. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Others were dumped in the Arkansas River or loaded onto trains and carried out of the city. Survivors buried their loved ones in unmarked graves, fearful of further violence. For the people of Greenwood, the massacre was not just the loss of homes and businesses. It was the destruction of a community and a way of life. Personal stories bring the tragedy into sharp relief. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the renowned surgeon, stepped out of his house with his hands raised. He was shot and killed in front of his family. Mary E. Jones. Parrish, a journalist, hid with her young daughter in a basement as white mobs searched for them. She later wrote a memoir describing the horror. "They shot them down like rabbits," she wrote. Men, women, and children. No one was safe. No place was safe. If you were black, they shot you. Anna Holland, another survivor, hid in a closet with her children, hearing her husband call for her outside. When she opened the door, a white man pointed a gun at her and said, "Get back in there or I'll blow your brains out." She never saw her husband again. W. D. Williams was pulled from his home at gunpoint, forced to kneel, and interrogated. A white man pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. Williams ran through gunfire and flames, narrowly escaping with his life. Terror, confusion, and grief reigned. The world that Greenwood's families had built, over years of struggle and hope, was reduced to rubble in a single night. When the sun rose on June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was unrecognizable. Where once there had been a thriving community, there was now only ash, twisted metal, and the skeletal remains of once proud buildings. The smoke lingered in the air, drifting over the city, a silent witness to the devastation. The survivors emerged from hiding places, basements, fields, and ditches. Many were barefoot, their clothes singed and torn, clutching what little they had managed to save. Children wept for missing parents. Parents searched for children lost in the chaos. They wandered the blackened streets, trying to make sense of what had happened overnight. The city's response was swift and cruel. Martial law was declared. The National Guard and city police patrolled the ruins, not to protect the survivors, but to control them. Black residents were rounded up, forced into internment camps at the fairgrounds, the convention hall, and the baseball stadium. They were held there for days, sometimes weeks. To leave, they needed a white person to vouch for them. Many had lost everything: their homes, possessions, money, and often their very sense of safety. Aid from the city was minimal. The Red Cross, led by Morris Willows, set up emergency tents and distributed food and clothing. Volunteers, both black and white, tried to help where they could. But the scale of the destruction was overwhelming. 10,000 people, almost the entire black population of Tulsa, were left homeless. The city commission, rather than helping Greenwood rebuild, saw opportunity in the ashes. They passed ordinances requiring all new construction in Greenwood to be brick or stone, a cost beyond the reach of most survivors. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, declaring the destruction a riot and excluding it from coverage. Families who had paid premiums for years were told they would receive nothing. Black Tulsans who attempted to return and rebuild found themselves blocked at every turn. City leaders even tried to force black residents to relocate to the outskirts of Tulsa, proposing new zoning laws that would move them far from where Greenwood had stood. But survivors resisted. They set up tents on their own land. They rebuilt makeshift homes from the rubble. They refused to abandon the ground where their hopes and history were rooted. It was during this time that B.C. Franklin, the lawyer and community leader, became a crucial figure. He and a handful of other attorneys established a law office in a tent. They fought the city's new building codes and zoning laws. They challenged insurance denials in court. Franklin's determination and the resilience of Greenwood's residents eventually forced Tulsa to allow rebuilding, though the road ahead would be long and hard. But as the physical cleanup began, another kind of destruction was already underway: the erasure of memory. City leaders, the police, and the press began to bury the story of what had happened. The Tulsa Tribune destroyed copies of the incendiary editorial that helped incite the violence. Official records were purged or lost. For decades, the massacre was barely mentioned in newspapers, classrooms, or city histories. Survivors were often discouraged, or outright threatened, when they tried to speak out. Families handed down the stories in whispers, passing the truth from parent to child. But for most of the country, the tragedy of Greenwood faded into silence. Despite this, the human toll endured. Many survivors left Tulsa, scattering to other cities and states. Those who stayed faced decades of rebuilding. Churches, schools, and businesses slowly rose from the rubble. But the wounds, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. The story of Greenwood, for many years, became a story of both endurance and loss. A lost community, a lost generation, and a legacy that would not be fully reckoned with for nearly a century. In the years that followed the destruction of Greenwood, the scars left behind were not just physical. Survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives, families, and a community from the ground up. Against overwhelming odds, they began again. Tents and shacks dotted the landscape where proud homes and businesses once stood. Churches became shelters. Neighbors pooled resources, sharing what little food, clothing, and hope they had left. Within a year, a new Greenwood began to rise. New stores opened their doors. Children went back to school and hastily repaired classrooms. Services resumed at churches, even as congregations gathered under makeshift roofs. But the challenges were immense. Most families had lost everything. Insurance companies never paid. Banks rarely offered loans. For many, the only capital available was sweat, determination, and a deep sense of community. Even in adversity, the entrepreneurial spirit that built Greenwood endured. By the 1940s, Greenwood once again boasted a thriving business district. Black doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, and teachers rebuilt institutions, and a new generation grew up hearing stories of both tragedy and triumph. Yet the trauma lingered. For decades, survivors were denied justice. No one was ever prosecuted for the killings, arson, or theft. The city and state offered no compensation. The official story remained buried, unspoken in schools, denied in the press, and omitted from history books. Still, the people of Greenwood carried the memory. They passed their stories down in churches, at kitchen tables, and during family gatherings. A handful of historians, activists, and journalists kept asking questions, refusing to let the truth disappear. In the late 20th century, as the civil rights movement swept across America, a new push for recognition began. Survivors and their descendants demanded that the massacre be acknowledged. They called for the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma to reckon with the past. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the Oklahoma legislature established the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. Over the next 5 years, investigators gathered survivor testimonies, combed through public records, and searched for mass graves. The commission's final report, released in 2001, was unequivocal. It described the events of 1921 as a government-sanctioned massacre. It documented the deliberate destruction of black wealth and the systematic cover-up that followed. The report recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. But the state and city, while issuing apologies, did not follow through with direct payments. For many, the struggle for justice continued. Survivors, some then in their 90s and hundreds, spoke before lawmakers and judges. They shared memories of terror, loss, and the enduring hope that the truth would finally be recognized. The search for answers extended to the land itself. Archaeologists, using ground-penetrating radar, discovered evidence of mass graves in Tulsa. Excavations began, and the city was forced to confront the evidence of bodies that had lain hidden for generations. As the centennial of the massacre approached, national and international attention grew. Documentaries, books, and news stories brought Greenwood's story to a new audience. In 2021, 100 years after the massacre, the President of the United States visited Tulsa and called for the country to remember. But for survivors and their families, remembrance alone was not enough. They continued to call for justice, reparations, and the restoration of lands and wealth that were stolen. The legacy of Greenwood is not just a story of devastation. It is a story of resilience, of a community that rebuilt again and again against the odds, of families who refused to let the truth be buried, and of a nation still grappling with the consequences of its own history. The story of the Tulsa Massacre is not confined to a single night in 1921, nor to the city blocks of Greenwood. It is a story woven into the fabric of American history, a reminder of what communities can build and what hate can destroy. For decades, Tulsa's black community pressed forward. They rebuilt churches, reopened businesses, and sent their children to school along the same streets where flames once raged. But the trauma and injustice lingered, shaping lives and futures for generations. The silence around Greenwood's destruction was never total. Survivors like Viola Fletcher, who was only 7 years old in 1921, carried their memories for more than a century. In 2021, at the age of 107, Fletcher testified before Congress. She spoke of the terror she witnessed, the loss her family endured, and the pain of living in a nation that tried to erase her story. Other survivors and their descendants joined her in seeking justice. They demanded that Tulsa and the nation not only remember but also repair. Their voices echoed in courtrooms, city halls, and classrooms, calling for restitution, recognition, and the return of land and dignity. The search for mass graves continued as scientists and historians worked to recover the truth that had been buried beneath layers of soil and silence. Each discovery brought new questions and a renewed commitment to honor those who had been lost. Across America, the story of Greenwood catalyzed conversations about history, race, and justice. Communities examined their own pasts, asking what had been hidden and what still needed to be made right. The legacy of Greenwood is one of pain, but also of persistence. It is found in the courage of those who rebuilt, the determination of those who demanded justice, and the hope of those who still believe in a better future. Today, the Greenwood District stands as both a memorial and a living neighborhood, a place where families gather, businesses open their doors, and visitors come to learn. The scars remain, but so too does the spirit that built Black Wall Street. We tell this story not just to remember the past, but to shape the future, to bear witness to the resilience of a people, to challenge the silence that so often follows injustice, and to honor the memory of Greenwood, not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to hope, community, and the unbreakable will to rise again.